And of course, the climate crisis is not only a reality now, but it's critical as we look to probably having less than a decade before we breach the critical 1.5-degree guardrail, which will further amplify all of the worst existing inequalities. And yet governments and big business continue with the policies of extractivism that threaten our very life support system. As we face a global recession, which will plunge further millions of people into extreme poverty and could potentially lead up to, as some estimate, up to half of all jobs in the global south. The question that faces all of us is, how do we build a vision, articulate political demands, and build power towards a fairer, just and more equal world where every worker, where every community has a right to a dignified life? How do we rebuild a vision of internationalism and global solidarity? And that's been at the very heart of this conversation about building a radical global Green New Deal, which guarantees people a living wage, of social protection, of public services, whilst at the same time tackling the crisis of climate and global inequality. And today we're joined by really four very, very distinguished panelists. We're joined by Josua Mata, Secretary General of SENTRO, which is an alliance of Filipino workers, which represents workers in the private, public and informal sectors, including migrant workers, women and youth. SENTRO is an affiliate of the ITUC, and its members are currently affiliated with the IUF, Industrial, PSI, amongst other global federations. Josua himself has been a leading figure in the global movement, in the labour movement, both in the Philippines and globally, and has been a forefront of the struggles around what a genuine just transition for workers would look like, what a transformative agenda, including public control of energy, could be. We're also joined by Anton, who's the Joint Secretary of FTZ&GSEU, which is the Free Trade Zones and General Services Employers Union. FTZ organises amongst garment and textile workers and has been at the forefront of holding multinational companies, including many UK clothing manufacturers, to account. We all saw the pictures of garment workers, not just in Sri Lanka, but all across the world, being left without pay, without support, as the COVID lockdown shut down factories. And FTZ has been at the forefront of not only organising workers, but of providing emergency support to workers and their communities as they currently fight both the devastating impacts of COVID, but also the union busting as governments and big business try and roll back workers' rights in the context of the COVID crisis. We are also joined by our great friend and ally, Dr. Jason Hickel, who's a renowned writer and academic and economic anthropologist and senior lecturer at Goldsmith University. Many of you know that Jason's work and his particular research has focused on global inequality, on political economy, on post-development, and on the ecological economy and the multiple crises that we faced. His two most recent books, and I'd urge you to go out and buy both because they're brilliant books. One, The Divide, which was a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions, and his recent book, which has just come out, which is Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. And last but not least, we're also joined by Sam Mason from PCS, the union. Again, one of War and Want's great affiliates and a great colleague that we work with. Sam is a national policy officer at PCS and is a leading figure in both the UK and global discussions around climate change and a just transition, and has recently helped author a new pamphlet on just transition and energy democracy. The way we're going to have today's webinar is I'll ask each of the panelists to speak. They'll be here for about 8 minutes. Then I will open for questions from the participants. Please use the chat feature. If you've got questions as speakers are speaking, please put them in and we'll try and aggregate some of those questions and have the panelists speak. So less of me and more of the panelists. I will ask my first speaker, who is going to be Jason Hickel, who will be followed by Josua, then Anton, and then closing will be Sam. So over to you, Jason.
Thanks very much, and it's a real honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And for those of you who are attending, I look forward to the engagement. And also an honor, Sam, Anton, and Josua, to be with you. Thank you for the work that you've been doing. So my intervention is very brief and very specific. And also, I think, probably counterintuitive for most people in the trade union movement. So, so bear with me. I think it will be exciting, but also quite challenging. The first thing I want to emphasize, though, is this, that we are facing a crisis right now, an ecological crisis that is not a single front, but multi-front, okay? So we tend to think of it as primarily about climate change. And of course, we can see this happening around us right now, as Asad mentioned. The fires in the US West Coast, historically unprecedented. The fires in the Amazon rainforest that are extremely destructive. Nigeria just lost 25% of its crops to flooding. There's been floods in India and Pakistan. Karachi has been underwater. There are presently, today, huge chunks of ice breaking off, not only from the Greenland ice shelf, but also from Antarctica, much earlier than scientists assumed was going to happen at this present level. Now, right now, we are at 1 degree of warming. So imagine what it will be like when we're at 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. I mean, this is a future that we do not want to countenance. We need much more radical action on this issue, and I think this is abundantly clear to all. Now, it's important to emphasize that the UK is one of the largest single contributors, aside from Germany and the USA, to the climate crisis, primarily because of a very long history of intensive fossil fuel use, okay? So the UK has an extraordinary responsibility to respond to this crisis and lead the way. And the labor movement must be part of that. But it's not just the climate crisis. We're also facing a variety of other ecological crises, which are being driven not by emissions, but rather by excess resource use, okay? So globally right now, the world economy is consuming 90% in excess of the sustainable level of resource use. And this is being caused almost entirely by excess consumption in high-income nations, such as the UK. And it's causing a range of problems, including biodiversity collapse, right? Species extinction, deforestation, soil depletion, et cetera, et cetera. And the impacts of this are happening in the places where excess resources are being extracted for consumption in the global north, right? So in places like in the mountains of Latin America, in the mines of the Congo, from the forests of Indonesia, et cetera. That's where the damage is happening. So it's important to recognize the global justice dimensions of this crisis. Now, okay, to the interesting stuff. What I want to emphasize here is that these crises are being driven at a structural level by our pursuit of GDP growth, okay? Now, GDP growth is very tightly coupled to both energy use and resource use, which is why we're seeing the more we grow GDP, especially in high-income nations that already have very high levels of GDP, the more we're seeing ecological breakdown progress, right? And when it comes to energy use, the more energy we use as we grow our economies, the more difficult it is for us to transition to renewable alternatives, right? The more we grow the economy, the more energy we use, the more difficult it is to achieve a rapid transition to renewables. This is why, despite the fact that we've had extraordinary developments in renewable energy outlays, we're still seeing global emissions rise because growth is outstripping our gains through renewable energy, okay? So it's making our task much more difficult. Now here's the question. Why do we pursue GDP growth in the first place? This is where we get to the nub of the issue. The reason is because we've been told to believe that it's essential for creating jobs and for improving people's lives. We believe that GDP growth is a proxy for economic and human progress, okay? And both the left and the right agree on this. And the trade union movement is aligned with this perspective typically as well, right? Of course, the left and the right bicker about how to distribute the yields of growth, but on the question of do we need growth, they're united in agreement, right? But here's the thing. The idea that we need more GDP growth to improve people's lives and create jobs is a lie. We do not need more growth to achieve our social goals, right? So this might sound counterintuitive, but here's some data. So the UK has a GDP per capita of £33,000, making it one of the richest countries in the world, right? But there are a number of countries in Europe and elsewhere across the world that have less than half that amount of GDP per capita, and yet they have better social indicators across the board, better life expectancy, better health outcomes, less poverty, better wages, higher levels of happiness and well-being, etc. How do they manage to achieve these outstanding social results with less GDP per capita? The reason is because they share existing income more fairly, and they invest in robust universal public services. Over and over again, it's clear that if you want to improve social indicators and accomplish your social goals, that is what counts. An equal distribution of existing income rather than trying to plunder the earth for more, giving it to the rich and letting it trickle down to the rest of society, right? That is an ecologically insane way of trying to solve our social problems. And also it's clear that the more we invest in public services, the more people can access the resources they need to live flourishing lives without needing high levels of private income in order to do so, right? So we invest in public services, you take pressure off the planet. You reduce inequality, you take pressure off the planet, right? Now, what about jobs? Let me address this briefly. Capitalism suffers from what we call the productivity trap, right? So we have constant increases in labor efficiency. But what that means is that we constantly create unemployment, right? The more efficient labor becomes, the less you need labor to generate the same output, right? So unemployment rises. What do you do with all the people who are unemployed? You have to then grow the economy, create new jobs to mop those people up and give them livelihoods, okay? And you never catch up, right? There's never a point at which you've solved the employment problem. There's never a point at which growth automatically solves the employment problem, right? The more you grow, the more the problem persists, okay? So effectively, we're in the situation of creating arbitrary make work, right? Let's stimulate, some industry to create more jobs, whether or not we actually need that industry or not, right? With pressure on the planet. We don't have to do it that way. There's an alternative. We can simply shorten the working week and share necessary labor in the society more fairly. So take the example of the COVID crisis right now, right? Clearly, demand has reduced in the economy quite a lot, and a lot of people have been laid off as a consequence. This is going to be a big issue. But do we need to stimulate unnecessary demand for unnecessary products and services that people don't actually want to be consuming right now, right? Simply in order to create more jobs to mop up this unemployment? That's crazy. Why not simply distribute the existing necessary labor more fairly, right? With a shorter working week and a job guarantee, recognizing there's a lot of work to be done in the economy that we need. We need to be building wind turbines and solar panels and installing them. We need to be retrofitting houses, right? We need to be investing in care, ecological regeneration. There's lots of work that has to be done. The private sector is not going to do that. We need a public job guarantee that will ensure people have access to meaningful, socially necessary, useful work at a dignified living wage. That can be done very cheaply, right? So to me, that is a saner and more ecologically sound way to address the problem of unemployment, rather than growing the economy with extreme ecological damage as consequence in order to mop up unemployed labor, right? We need a saner way to do this. So what's exciting about this is that the idea of a job guarantee is extremely popular, and a shorter working week, extremely popular. These are powerful ecological tools that deliver better lives to workers, right? Improve gender egalitarianism, improve well-being and health outcomes, et cetera, right? By popular, I mean 74% of the British public support these measures, right? And yet, remarkably, the trade union movement is not lined up behind them. This needs to be front and center of our demands, okay? We need to be calling for a 30-hour work week, calling for a public job guarantee. It is absolutely possible and feasible and ecologically essential. And also, in as much as it liberates high-income nations like the UK from the pursuit of perpetual growth, it is in line with the principles of global justice. Okay, so I want to conclude just briefly by saying this. We have to get rid of the idea that growth is what we need, that growth is good for us. The idea that growth is good for us as people, right, is the ideology of capitalism. What's really, like what are the real mechanisms behind growth? It's surplus value accumulation. It's accumulation for the elite, right, which comes from appropriation from labor and from the natural world, depleting both, okay? So capitalism takes that process of appropriation and exploitation and sells it back to us as growth, which sounds so natural and so good, and we all buy into it. We must reject the ideology of growth, recognizing it as capital's form of cultural hegemony, which gets us to buy into a system that we otherwise would all reject as violent and destructive, right? So let's call that out. Let's get the trade union movement to back away from the ideology of growth and organize the economy, not around elite accumulation and exploitation, but instead around human well-being and ecological stability. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. A very challenging frame for us to begin with, and I'm sure I can already see that questions are starting to be asked, and I think it moved very, very nicely into Josua, who I think when we talk about growth and we talk about the challenges of the workers, both in the global north and in the global south, frontline unions and workers' organizations have been very much at the forefront of trying to rethink what would a just economy look like, what does a just transition look like. So I'm very honored to be able to move over to Josua from SENTRO.
Thank you, Asad, and thanks for inviting me here. And that was a great presentation, Dr. Jason, and I think that there's a lot of food for thought for trade unionists even. But let me tell you our own story here on how do we struggle for just transition and energy democracy in the Philippines, even at the time of pandemic. And I think it's best to say this story with a clear background, that we are also at the same time fighting a dictatorship while facing COVID-19, an economic recession, and of course, climate change. How do I describe the situation? Well, let me begin by saying these are the best of times and the worst of times. Let me start with the worst of times. Like most authoritarian governments around the world, Mr. Duterte initially downplayed the threat of the virus. And so when it started, he panicked and responded with a harsh militarized lockdown as if we were actually under a real invasion. And yet, despite suffering from the world's longest and harshest lockdown, Mr. Duterte still failed to contain the virus. Now, as we speak, more than 250,000 Filipinos have been infected and 4,300 have been killed. And more importantly, and this is where Jason's point comes in, the economic growth which the country has been pursuing for many, many years, took only a few weeks to unravel when the lockdowns began. And that's the reason why now we are facing the worst recession we've ever had since World War II, with 10% of the working class being unemployed. And in Metro Manila alone, it's a high 15% of not having any job. The pandemic further exposed inequities in our country, as I suppose in many other countries, like in your own country, where the rich can easily endure the lockdown, eat food that they can easily hoard from whatever grocery they go to, and enjoy their Netflix and cable TV. And if they get bored, they just jump into their SUVs and move around the city. Well, not for the poor. Many of the poor suffer from hunger, the drudgery and the boredom of staying in their homes after the government shut down free TV. And I'll get back to that later. And while at the same time, they are literally imprisoned in their own depressed communities. But rather than address the fundamental problems, these huge problems faced by the working class, the government actually used its time and energy and our own resources to do things that they cannot do under normal conditions. What are these? One, rather than come up with support for those who are hungry, they actually engineered the shutting down of the biggest TV network in the country simply because, at the time of a pandemic, simply because that TV station was viewed as too critical of the president. They phased out jeepneys, and these are the cheapest means of transportation for many workers now in the Philippines. They shut down, they used the pandemic as a pretext to phase out these jeepney drivers, and leading to which drove about 100,000 workers, particularly in Metro Manila, to go out in the streets and literally beg for food. Now they want to even pass a legislation where electric cooperatives in the country would be taken over by corporations, making sure then that electricity rates would go up as soon as they do this. But as if that is not enough, Mr. Duterte and his minions in Congress even impose on us a new law that allows them to practically go after everyone that is criticizing him with this new it's a draconian anti-terrorism law where everyone who speaks against the government can easily be tagged as a terrorist. Meanwhile, while all these horrendous things are happening, extrajudicial killings because of the war on drugs, which continued despite the pandemic, has actually risen to 50% more deaths. That's right. While we were all on lockdown, 50%, the killings, extrajudicial killings, actually increased by 50% as compared to the same number of, as compared to the previous 4 months since we have been locked down, just before we have been locked down. It is the worst of times. But it is also the best of times, I'd say, because first, invisible people, workers in particular, suddenly became essential. That's great. Women, especially those who were who were suffering from prostitution, found ways to live without actually selling their bodies. Third, at the same time, there was an overflow of kindness and compassion, even as Duterte government's harshness is impinging on all of us. People started sharing their food. Like our members, they started setting up community kitchens in order to ameliorate the hunger in many of the communities where we operate. The youth, but this is the more important point for me, the youth have actually started to rise up, realizing their capacity for collective action. And it's just simply inspiring. But the best part, again, apart from the fact that the youth are rising up, is that many groups, including my own organization, have started working not only with other labor groups, but also with other social movements and civil society organizations, even political organizations, in order to push back and increase the resistance against the dictatorship. That's the context. Now, how do we fight for energy democracy and just transition in this point in time? Remember, I told you that the government used the pandemic as a pretext to phase out the jeepneys in the Philippines. Well, the thing is, even if they are trying to phase out the jeepneys, the transport workers organizations have started pushing for a just transition program that would allow them to shift to new vehicles that would be less pollutive, even if it's still using fossil fuel, unfortunately, but at least they would be able to save their jobs. No? And even if they had in the pandemic, the government now is in a very, very bad position where they had to say that they have no plans of phasing out jeepney drivers simply because they have kept on fighting. Meanwhile, those workers in the electric cooperatives which distributes electricity outside of Metro Manila are also fighting against corporate takeover by organizing, or even in this time of pandemic, they continue working, the workers continue working with the consumer, with the citizens that they provide electricity to, with the local governments that they work with, the media and the academics, in order to expose the corporations and the politicians who are being backed up by these corporations who wanted to take over the franchises of these electric cooperatives, even as we are still in a lockdown. This is what we're trying to do. And in the meantime, SENTRO, together with other labor unions, as Jason has said, we have started at least now we are now putting forward a labor agenda that is questioning essentially the development paradigm that we have, and pushing for full employment through expansion of public services in order to take care to take care of our health, our environment, and at the same time providing job guarantees for everyone. So these are the things that we're trying to do, even as we are fighting a dictatorship. I'll stop there. I think I took up more time as I should, and I'm sorry if I did.
No, very well. Thank you very much, Joshua. And of course, solidarity to you and all to workers all around the world who were facing these multiple crises in the context of this rise of authoritarianism on the far right, with their anti-worker, anti-trade union and reactionary framework, which, we've seen rise in Philippines, in India, in Brazil, in the US, in so many different countries. So this challenge that we have of both providing a broader vision, of tackling the existing inequalities and transitioning, sometimes seems really, really huge. And I want to move on to our next speaker, who's Anton from FTZ, where that challenge has been very, very real. here, you know, we talk a lot about, well, the global north's consumption, it drives so much of these inequalities and injustices. But we saw that the moment that that consumption stopped, as we saw with the garment industry, workers were simply left destitute without the necessary public services, without social protection, and with a tax on workers. And how do we make sure that in any transition, workers' rights are protected in a centre? Well, Anton is going to speak a little bit about what the situation for garment workers was in the context of COVID and their struggle as FTZ. Anton. You're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Sorry, I think that's it. Anton, you're unmuted now.
Okay.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you for the opportunity. In fact, you know, compared to other countries, Sri Lankan, you know, controlled the pandemic, but we know that the economic repercussions is very serious, especially on the workers. You know, when the pandemic was started in March, end of the March, the government decided to lock down and declared a curfew. And what happened, when the curfew was imposed, the most of the garment workers in the free trade zones, especially near the airport, there is a big free trade zone where around 45,000 workers are working, and 80% of them are female, and 70% of them are migrated from far villages working in the boarding houses, private boarding houses. So because of the curfew, the workers were, you know, stranded at the boarding houses, and even the boarding house owners do not want to see that they are staying at boarding houses because of the health risky. And so they were really stranded because employers, the owners of the factory, they did not care about the workers. And so we had to intervene, and we asked the government to immediately make arrangements for workers to go back to their villages. In the meantime, when they were stranded at boarding houses, we have to support them by distributing dry rationals and supporting them because they didn't have money, because they didn't get the wages for the month of March. So in Sri Lanka, you know, there are about 500,000 garment workers, and majority of 80% of them are females, and most of them are migrated from far villages and living in the private boarding houses. So, just before the pandemic, the situation of the garment industry was there were 74,000 machine operators vacancies because the workers do not want to join the garment industry because they were underpaid, their conditions were so bad, their working condition as well as living condition. But immediately after the pandemic situation, when the government declared a curfew and even trade union could not do anything. And then in the meantime, when the reopened the factory after middle of April, the government imposed the condition that in order to maintain the distancing, social distancing, only 50% of the workers can be called for work. Then there was a problem because what will happen to the other 50% if the employer is going to employ only 50%? And then we, as a trade union, we call the government that this is the situation where the government cannot find the solution their own, even the employers cannot, even the trade union cannot. So we have to come together, and there should be a joint program in order to face this situation. So as a result of our intervention, the government formed or appointed the tripartite task force to handle this situation. In the same time, we were pushing the government that there will be no dismissal or layoff of the employees because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the government also took that position, and government said when the factories are reopened, the workers has to be retained. No single employee has to be dismissed. On that basis, we negotiated with the employers, and finally we were agreed that if the workers are going to call 50%, and they should call workers on rotation by giving the same position or opportunities for them to work. So as a result of that, when the workers are working, they have to pay their full wages. When the workers are not working, we compromise with the employers that they have to pay either 50% of their basic wages or 14,500 rupees, whichever the highest. So at the beginning, the government employers, they said there are 500,000 employees, they want to get rid of 300,000. But we said, no way, we can't allow any workers to be dismissed, because this is not the time to workers to dismiss. This is the time they should protect the workers. So as a result of our intervention and the tripartite negotiation, we can say that we were able to minimize the dismissal. According to the employers, they said only 10,000 workers have been dismissed, but according to our calculation, around 30,000 employees have been dismissed. That is also not formal dismissal. Some of the employers, they did not dismiss the workers. Instead of that, they stopped providing transport for workers to come to work. And some of the employers, they even stopped providing meals, breakfast and lunch. They stopped those things. And at the same time, they suspended the attendant bonus, and workers were not in a position to earn something. And so some of the workers could not report for work because there was no transport. Then some employers considered them as vacated their post. So this situation, and we are now pushing the government, because we believe that this situation, not the brands that these workers were producing for, has to be taken this responsibility. We cannot allow brands to wash their hands. At the same time, we cannot allow employers, the suppliers, to wash their hands. At the same time, we cannot allow government to wash their hands. So all have to take the responsibility. But unfortunately, even within this situation, some of the employers have closed down their factories under the pretext of reduction of workforce. And some of the employers or suppliers have stopped even their breakfast and lunch, and even the providing transport and other things. But unfortunately, those factories are producing for biggest brands, even brands such as Next. And these Next brands, some of the factories they are producing for Next brand, they also stop providing breakfast, lunch, and even their transport. So we can see that, because we know our position is this situation. This is the way only way we can fight back and protect the employment, protect their living conditions, is to have international solidarity, because this is the global situation and we have to find the global solution. And therefore, we feel that this is the time we need to solidarity among the trade unions, among the consumer groups, among the other people's organizations, and we should try to push the brands and to fulfill their responsibility, because they have to take the responsibility, because now this is the time where workers need the living wage, because the most of the workers, the garment workers, are the breadwinners of their families. So they have to support their families also. And most of these female workers, because they came from far villages and living in the urban area, they have changed their lifestyle and they got a very bad image. You know, when the in Asian countries, culturally, the female has to stay with their families. If they come out from the families, and they will get very bad image. And now when they come here to earn something, to get married, but now they have lost their income and they can't go back to their villages. And so the female workers in a very bad position. And the only way we should support and we should push the brands to take the responsibility, they should pay the wages, they should ensure that their suppliers will pay the workers to the living wage and they will protect their job security. So I think we should discuss this issue together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anton. Absolutely. And I think this challenge of how do we defend existing workers' rights, the importance of solidarity of the global labour movement, and how we hold corporations and governments to account. But at the same time, also making sure that we're demanding the kind of transformative demands, such as living wages, social protection, universal public services, I think sits at the very heart of this question about what does a just transition actually look like. Last but not least is Sam Mason from the Public Services PCS, the union, which has been very, very much at the heart of this big conversation. What does a just transition, and how do we make sure that in this just transition, workers and their communities sit at the centre? And so I'll hand over to Sam Mason from the PCS.
Thanks, Asad, and thanks everybody and for the invitation to participate on this panel, which is always very humbling with such great people, and Josua, listening to Anton, and obviously to follow Dr. Jason Hickel. I was just going to start, I mean, I hopefully this will sort of round up some of the comments which have already been made from the sense around the global trade union movement. But I thought it was really interesting at the start of the pandemic. I read an article by McKinsey and Company, so not World Revolutionaries, but about addressing climate change in the post-pandemic world, making a distinction between the pandemic as a physical shock as opposed to the financial shock that happened in 2008, 2009. And one thing it said in that article, which has been quite a rehearsed line now, and a lot of commentators obviously made the parallel that the pandemic is a foretaste of what a full-fledged climate crisis would entail. And the need to understand the pandemic in these terms was interesting. But obviously, as we've moved on some months from that initial analysis, and I thought adjusting to this situation, clearly the limitations of that have been exposed, and partly, and which obviously Jason Hickel has pointed on, we're actually already living in a climate and environmental crisis. We're living in a health, financial, economic and social crisis and a political crisis. And all these started before the pandemic hit. And of course, what that did is it kind of supercharged it right into our current ways in which we're all living and sort of coping with the pandemic in our individual situations, our national situations, and obviously globally and collectively. But of course, the McKinsey analysis, unsurprisingly, didn't address issues of political economy and therefore the prevailing market and political logic which dominates the capitalist system, which has obviously been a factor and clearly, you know, closely linked to the climate change as well. And as many have already said, COVID has sharpened the already pre-existing recognised inequalities around race, class, gender, disability, who could work during lockdown, who couldn't, who immediately lost their jobs, social protections, particularly also including migrant workers. And it massively exposed the failure of our institutions. So the hollowing out, you know, particularly in the UK, but not exclusively, the hollowing out of the welfare state, public institutions such as the NHS, which have been central, you know, between central and local government and the NHS, which has accentuated inability to actually cope with a major pandemic, and which is playing out, you know, in the UK, and still bizarrely in this need to try and privatise the track and tracing, this privatisation that's actually going on in the midst of the health sector whilst the pandemic is still underway. But of course, there were sort of some positive things that arose around reevaluating the jobs momentarily, turning the hierarchy of the jobs valued in society on its head. So we started to actually appreciate healthcare workers, even civil servants who work in the job centres, had a phenomenal job in PCS delivering the universal credit system, and the millions that have had to take recourse to benefits, you know, many for the first time in their working lives. But of course, there's lots I think we learn from this, from our own just transition narrative, and what's very wrong, and particularly in our sort of northern hemisphere just transition framing. For example, the lack of a political analysis of power in transition, who has power and how it's used, and this sort of model of green capitalism, which actually gets played out within our just transition story, particularly in the UK. And who's involved in that just transition. It's a very narrow transition. It doesn't look across the whole of society and the whole of workers in society. But it also, as such, misses the need for public services to form the foundational basis for a just transition and social protection. So I think I'm trying to be quite quick, because I know there's lots of questions I think we should get to, but I think what we need to start rediscussing the just transition in terms of a pro-public agenda, which has to be at its core, recognising the vital role that public services play in our collective life. But we also need to envisage our public services and understand their interconnectivity, and as being essential for the transitions we need across the whole of the economy, not just in the UK, but globally. You know, so understanding energy as a public good within our energy democracy framework. It's not about privatised energy. And at the moment, even if that's fossil fuel energy, is reclaiming that back into public ownership under democratic control, which obviously links into social housing and links into our transport policies. And Asad had mentioned our work around energy democracy. We have actually just released a new pamphlet called Aviation Democracy, where PCS is calling for aviation to be seen as a public service, and the whole of the aviation sector brought that back into public ownership, which is probably quite radical for most. But I think we've had a lot of discussions around Build Back Better, green recoveries. These are dominating, I think, a lot of national agendas, not just in the UK. But I think what we have to do is build back a pro-public agenda for a global Green New Deal. We need the pro-public agenda and reversal of privatisations and the business models that have obviously seen a race to the bottom on jobs, paying conditions across a number of sectors. We also need a new trade unionism, which I think has been hinted at in some of the contributions. And we need, as Anton has referred to, that strong worker global solidarity. And Josua didn't mention it, and I thought he might, but we've just been participating the past few months, although the planning for this goes back much further, in a global trade union assembly, getting behind a statement of a principle for a commitment to defend, restore, and re-envision vital public services for the post-COVID era. And this is really about having a holistic and comprehensive strategy to reclaim and strengthen public services and build a new social and economic system based on social, economic, environmental justice in the interest of all people and planet. And for us, that really has to be part of the global pro-public Green New Deal. And I very much hope that's where we start to build our real global labour solidarity across trade unions and work collectively on this agenda. So, you know, we can support the points that Anton has made, obviously support the struggles that Josua has in the Philippines, and respond to the issues that Jason has so clearly raised around what our new world starts to look like, and question these assumptions that we continue to talk about around GDP growth, productivity, etc. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you to all of our speakers. We've got a whole series of questions. I'm just trying to think of trying how we bring all of those together. I suppose a big question is that this framework of, like, you know, a global transition that doesn't think about just tinkering around the edges, but thinks about transforming the global economy. How does the labour movement deal with the global dimension when so much of workers' organisations are, of course, within their national context and trying to defend workers' existing conditions, let alone having the ability to be able to transform more globally? And I'd welcome all of your contributions in terms of that. There was a question, I suppose, also maybe more directed to Jason. This whole, of course, it's a very sort of challenging vision about that goes really to the heart of our current economic model. How do you believe that we can persuade people to this vision that growth is not the answer that guarantees people dignity and a dignified life, and etc.? How do you think we can have that conversation more globally, and also maybe what you think or how you think that intervention can be made with the labour movement as well? I suppose the third one I would just ask is a bit of a question like, do trade unions need to change or adapt in order to organise around the fact that we face this multiple and global dimensional crises, and the way that global capital is moving, and that the points of intervention of this transformation are often not where we're organised? So what your reflections on that? So I'll start where maybe I'll start with in the same order we had people speaking. So Jason, over to you first.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, and thank you all for the presentations, really interesting. So good to hear from you. Okay, the first thing I want to say is this, right? Like, when it comes to getting people off of this growth delusion, the growth ideology, the ideology of capitalism, is to appeal, right, to political consciousness. Now, this means different things in different contexts. In the context of the UK trade union movement, I think the idea here is simply to say, look, right, the idea that growth is essential for workers' well-being is a lie perpetrated by those who benefit primarily from growth, which is the elite, which is capital, right? I mean, effectively, GDP growth is not a measure of well-being. It's not a measure of human well-being. It's a measure of the well-being of capital, right? That's literally what it is designed to do. So how is it that we have let ourselves buy into the idea that an indicator that measures the well-being of capital represents the well-being of the rest of us, right? If we can't pull off an attack on that ideology, then what is the point of political consciousness in the trade union movement, right? like this is something we have to focus on urgently. So that's for the global north, that's for the UK. For the global south, I think it's this message, that in the early post-colonial decades, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, global south governments, which were primarily progressive at the time, were organizing the economy around human well-being and human needs, right? We can see this across Latin America. We can see it in independent African countries. We can see it in Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera. Many of those progressive leaders were then deposed in Western-backed coups, too many for me to list right now. And in the wake of that, the World Bank and the IMF in the 1980s, specifically, imposed structural adjustment programs that forced global South nations to abandon their focus on human well-being and to focus instead on doing everything possible to facilitate the interests of capital, i.e. GDP growth, right? And now we're in the situation where the global South, despite being decolonized officially, remains colonized by this ideology of growth imposed by the former colonial masters, right? So this idea that like GDP growth is the best way for the global South to catch up or develop or whatever it is, it's not true. I mean, this is literally a metric imposed by technocrats and bankers in the West for the benefits primarily of Western capital, but also domestic national capital, right? So we need to recover our connection to the early post-colonial, arguments, which were that let's reject the organization of the colonial economy, organized around extraction, exploitation, et cetera, and organize instead around human well-being, right? That was the revolutionary argument in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we must reclaim that. Otherwise, we're lost. Otherwise, we're literally fighting on the same side as capital, and there's nothing to be gained from that. So there was another question, but I'll give my time to everybody else. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Joshua.
Well, thank you. Lots of big questions. I'm not really sure if I have any answers to any of them. But let me just point out that three things. First of all, I think I am a firm believer of socialism. We may have different opinions and ideas on what that actually means, for that word actually means for all of us. But I've always believed that socialism as a vision is far more powerful and far more better than what we have today, capitalism. But at the same time, our problem is that, at least I'm speaking from our experience, is that I think what we lack is the political program that will make sure that that vision can actually be carried out. And together with that political program is the capacity to actually implement that political program. And that is where the problem is at this point in time. No? Contractualization in this country, together with the the repressive governments that we've had pushed the labor movement to a point where, to be honest, we are in one of our weakest points in our history at this point in time. And so when you go back to the second point, do trade unions need to change? Yes, definitely. And that's what we have been trying to do, not necessarily to reimagine, but essentially to go back to the roots of what we were when we started the movement in the Philippines long before. We didn't start as a movement of workers in the formal sector, only with the regular workers joining us. We started in a way that, whatever way that people can organize. And that's what we mean by when we say, let's go back to our ideas of social movement unionism, where we organize people wherever they are, whatever their situation is, whatever type of organization we can build, whether association, union, what have you, bring them all together and make sure that workers can actually fight beyond the bread and butter issues that we've always had in trade unions, so like collective bargaining, wages, and benefits. We also need to fight for a change in structural changes in society. And so the third point for me is just to say that, to give an example, that when I tried to explain the labor agenda that we were presenting as today, and part of that has a lot of there's a lot of resonance in what Dr. Jason has been saying, guaranteed income, guaranteed jobs, and for example, even the idea of expanding the public sector to address the social needs of people. But how do you finance it? The idea that we're pushing now is to, we're trying to make use of the whole idea of wealth tax in order to finance precisely these things that we need in our country. And my last point has to do with the global movement, our global labor movement. And thank you, Sam. Unfortunately, Sam might have jumped already. Thank you to Sam for reminding me that we've had actually a global trade union assembly where this question came up. And to be honest, we're still grappling with a real answer to that question. But what's important is that we believe that we need to reimagine global solidarity among us in a way that we can actually practically build it. So I'm not so sure if I actually answered any of your questions, but
well, you did. That was a great intervention. Anton, there was a specific question. There was a specific question also asking you, what does solidarity look like for you in terms of holding UK brands to account? And I know you're one of Warren-One's, long-term partners, and I wondered if you wanted to maybe give an example of what that practical solidarity to frontline workers could look like. You've muted yourself again, Anton. Anton, I think you're muted again. Yep, you're fine.
Okay. The practical solidarity we are seeking is to, this is the situation where we found that even the trade unions, the global unions, has to rethink about their negotiation models, because we feel that in the context of this situation, and we feel that the traditional way of negotiating or bargaining at plant level is questionable now, because the situation has changed more, and the workers' power is not only, of course, it's a basic for the plant level, but it is not enough. So we need a broader type of alliances building. And the solidarity what we are seeking at even the national level and the global level is that, we need a very broad alliance. Even we know that practically the global unions in this context are not in a position to, protect the interest of their members alone. So therefore, what we really need to see that we need a broader alliance. Based on that, only we will be able to fight back.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you. As with any of these interesting conversations, time is always our challenge, and coming to the end of this, and I want to, before I thank all the panelists, I think this panel is part of a much bigger series of work that War on Want, together with social movements, workers' organisations, trade unions from all around the world are developing. What would a radical framework of a global Green New Deal that can address the multiple crises as they've been outlined, from the crisis of COVID and the impending global recession, to the climate crisis, to the historical crisis of exploitation and resource extraction of the global south, and of course the realities of economic inequality and injustice, both in the global north and in the global south. I think we all recognise we can no longer tinker around the edges, and unless we have an alternative to win that social licence that we need for this transformation, there are others with alternative visions, and we can see that with the rise of the right and authoritarianism, with the mantra of walls and fences, the idea that we should just worry within the nation state. And of course, throughout history, there's been no social transformation or transition without the labour movement sitting in its heart. And I'm reminded, thinking back to the very foundation of the labour movements, a couple of 100 years ago, there was always two dual purposes. Yes, we have to protect the workers within the existing system, but we also have to fight to achieve an economy and a society which was controlled by the workers. And rethinking and reimagining what that global vision is, how we have the political education that is needed to build the power that we need. Because again, I think we all recognize that if we fight in our silos, we all lose. That this is the moment of the movement of movements to come together. But at its heart must be the labour movement and trade unions, and we must be able to guarantee people a guaranteed basic income, of social protection, of public services, not only in terms of the answer to the COVID crisis, but the answer to, of course, to the climate crisis and the inequality crisis. That the answer to the climate crisis is we have to start thinking about food and energy as public goods and as social goods, because it's the only way we're going to be able to think about how do we share them equally, and start to think and imagine what an economy that works for all of us is. What is the kind of economy that we actually want to invest in building? And then the key question that Joshua asked is, how do we finance this? We're in a moment where Amazon earns $20,000 per second, and yet, despite 30 years of so-called neoliberal policies, half the world is still living on less than $5 a day. We've seen an economy around the world where 70% of people are in the informal economy, in deregulated economies, and people increasingly in the economy, even in the global north, of zero-hour contracts, of precarious contracts, of low pay. How do we reimagine that economy to sit there? And also think about, how do we finance this? What is the transfer of finance and wealth? And of course, we come back to the question of the trade union movement being in its centre, because I'm always reminded that at the top of every banner of the trade union movement, it doesn't say workers of England unite, it says workers of the world unite. And when we're faced with a global problem and with a global crisis, a multiple global crisis, the most powerful social movement that's in operation today it remains the labour movement. And I think it's the labour movement that has to be at the centre of leading this conversation. But for anybody who's interested in being part of this, continuing this conversation, I will just put in the chat, you know, a link for you to just sign up to receive information from War on Want. This is, we have a series of digital roundtables, of public webinars. There was a question that one of the participants asked about, how do we intervene? We're in a critical moment. In November, we've got the 20. The UK is hosting the G7 next year. We've got the COP26. This is the moment for us to be talking both about a national agenda, but also a global agenda, and connecting those and connecting a vision together. This is a huge challenge, but you know, it's one that I think I'm very, very hopeful for, because if one thing that COVID has demonstrated to more and more people is that business as usual doesn't work for the majority of people. And even here in the UK, over 80% of people said they don't want to return to the old normal. And that is a demand that's always come from the global south. And I think it's starting to be echoed here in the global north as well. So this is an opportune moment for us to generally talk about a visionary and an interconnected set of demands, both at the global and the national level. I want to thank Jason and Josua and Anton and Sam, who had to rush away because she's on another panel at the TUC today. Thank you all for your valuable time. And to all of you, this issue is not going to be won, and it's not going to be fought by just a small number of us. It requires all of us to be collectively involved in building the power and building the vision and building the political demand and the program, as Joshua said. It's something that we've lacked. You know, often our movement has always said one no, many yeses, but the problem is now we need to articulate the yeses into a vision that can build a social license. So I'm really excited about this opportunity to move this conversation forward, to have some of the tough conversations that are outlined by Jason, but are necessary if we want to really think about a society and an economy that can both save our ecosystems and our life support systems and guarantee everybody a right to a dignified life. So thank you to everybody who's joined us today, and I hope the rest of your day is productive. And thank you again to all of our speakers. And unfortunately, we're virtual, otherwise you'll see a bunch of people clapping and applauding everybody on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Good night.
Bye.